สวัสดีค่ะเด็กๆเป็นยังไงกันบ้างคะเราเรียนกันมาจนถึง EP นี้คือ EP 5 แล้วนะคะก็นะถือว่าหนักหน่วงสำหรับการเรียนออนไลน์ของเรานะคะแต่ก็สู้ๆนะคะเด็กๆทุกคนในวันนี้นะคะเราจะเข้าสู่ EP 5 ในเรื่องของ absolute value and opposite numbers นะคะก็คือค่าสมบูรณ์และจำนวนตรงกันข้ามนั่นเองนะคะเดี๋ยวเราไปพบกันในบทเรียนได้เลยค่ะ
Hi, this is Rob. Welcome to Math Antics. In this lesson, we're going to learn about a math concept called absolute value. That sounds pretty intense, doesn't it? But don't worry, it's actually pretty simple. So simple, in fact, that it might seem kind of boring. At least that's the way I remember it when I was in school.
Okay, class. This is an absolute value sign. And it's like magic. If I put in a positive number, it comes out unchanged. But if I put in a negative number, then just like magic, it comes out positive. Any questions?
Well, maybe it wasn't quite that bad, but absolute value sure seemed a lot less exciting than the name suggested. It seemed like just a way to turn a negative number into a positive one. For example, the absolute value of 2 is 2, but the absolute value of negative 2 is also 2. The absolute value of 5 is 5, but the absolute value of negative 5 is also 5. See those vertical lines on either side of the numbers? That's the symbol used for absolute value. So when you see something in between those vertical lines, it means to find the absolute value of it. But what does absolute value even mean? From these examples, it seems like it's just the positive version of any number. Well, sort of.
ค่ะจากที่เขาถามนะคะว่า absolute value คืออะไรนะคะนักเรียนสังเกตค่ะ absolute ของ2นะคะจะเท่ากับ2 absolute ของ-2ก็จะเท่ากับ2 absolute ของ5เท่ากับ5 absolute ของ-5ก็เท่ากับ5เพราะฉะนั้นไม่ว่าค่าภายใน absolute จะเป็นค่าบวกหรือว่าค่าลบค่าที่ได้ออกมาจะต้องเป็นค่าบวกเท่านั้นนะคะเช่น absolute ของ-2ก็เท่ากับ2 absolute ของ-5ก็เท่ากับ5นั่นเองนะคะ
It's a little more involved than that. Absolute value is a more general concept in math that actually has more to do with the idea of distance than it does with the idea of positive or negative numbers. It's usually introduced in basic math right after you learn about negative numbers. But absolute value is a concept that's even more useful and more interesting in advanced math. Because of that, I'm going to teach you about absolute value using an idea that you usually don't encounter until a little later on in your math journey. And that idea is vectors. The term vector might sound kind of technical, but they're actually really simple. Vectors are basically just arrows. In real life, an arrow can have all sorts of different properties. For example, this arrow is made of wood and has feathers, while this arrow is red plastic with a round thingy at the end. But in math, the arrows we call vectors only have two properties. They have a direction and a magnitude. What do those two properties mean? Well, direction is pretty obvious. It's just which way the arrow or vector is pointing. It could be up, down, left, right, or just about any direction you can think of.
เวกเตอร์ก็คือทิศทางนะคะก็คือ1 direction ก็คือทิศทางนะคะไม่ว่าลูกศรจะชี้ไปทางไหนก็จะหมุนไปตามทิศทางนั้นนะคะสามารถไปได้หลายทิศทางค่ะ
But what does magnitude mean? Well, that word might make you think of an earthquake. Whew. Actually, magnitude is just a fancy word for the amount, extent, or strength of something.Like how strong an earthquake is, or how bright a star is, or how heavy an object is.
ส่วนคำว่า magnitude ก็คือน้ำหนักหรือว่าจำนวนหรือว่าปริมาณหรือขนาดนะคะซึ่งจะดูได้จากรูปภาพที่เขาให้ก็คือ ลูกน้ำหนัก20กิโลกรัมหรือว่าน้ำหนักในจักรวาลของโลกประมาณนี้นะคะ
In the case of a vector, you can think of magnitude as being the length of the arrow. To see what I mean, let's use the number line to measure some vectors. This vector has a magnitude, or length, of 2, because it starts at 0 and ends at 2. And this vector has a magnitude, or length, of 5, because it starts at 0 and goes to 5. Okay, so we know the magnitudes of these vectors, but what about their directions? Well, they're both pointing to the right on your screen, and since we're using the number line as our reference, they're pointing in the positive.
ค่ะจากภาพนี้ที่เราเห็นนะคะ magnitude ก็คือน้ำหนักนะคะหรือว่าขนาดนะคะก็คือตัวแรกเป็น5นะคะทิศทางไปทางขวานะคะลูกศรชี้ไปทางขวาขนาดตัวที่2นะคะจาก0ไปถึง2น้ำหนักหรือว่าขนาดก็จะเท่ากับ2นะคะทิศทางก็จะไปทางขวาเช่นเดียวกันค่ะ
The direction, right? But what about this vector here? It starts at 0, like our other vectors do, but it ends at -2. And the arrow indicates that it's pointing in the exact opposite direction from the other two vectors. It's pointing to the left or in the negative direction of the number line. So what do you think its magnitude is? For those of you that said 2, you're right. Even though the vector is pointing in the negative direction, its length is still a positive number. Its length is 2, just like this vector that's pointing in the positive direction. They're pointing in opposite directions. But if you rotate one vector around, you can see that they really do have the same length or magnitude. And another way to say that is that they have the same absolute value.
ค่ะจากภาพนี้นะคะทิศทางนะคะตอนแรกไปทิศทางที่เป็นลบนะคะจาก0ไป-2แต่ก็มีขนาดเท่ากันคือ2ใช่ไหมคะเราพลิกลูกศรกลับด้านคืนมานะคะก็จะได้เป็น2เท่ากันจาก0ถึง2ซึ่งมองจากภาพเรารู้แล้วค่ะว่าขนาดของเขาเป็นไงคะเท่ากันเพราะฉะนั้นนั่นคือ absolute value นั่นเองค่ะ
See why I said that absolute value has more to do with distance? In fact, when it comes to any number that you'd find on the number line, you can think of its absolute value as its distance from 0. That explains why absolute value is a little bit boring when you first learn about it. Because the number line is a one-dimensional space, there are only two possible directions, positive or negative. If you ask for the absolute value of any positive number along that line, you're asking for the distance that number is from 0, which is just the number itself. And since the negative numbers are a mirror image of their positive counterparts, when you ask for the absolute value of any negative number along the line, the only difference is the direction or sign of that number. And that's why the absolute value of a negative number is just its positive counterpart. Hopefully, that seems a little more interesting than just thinking about absolute value as a way to turn negative numbers into positive ones. In advanced math, absolute value gets even more interesting. And it actually gets kind of complex. Vectors can point in all sorts of directions besides just positive or negative. But hopefully, thinking about absolute value as the magnitude or length of a vector makes it a little more interesting, and it shows you that absolute value isn't just some silly rule that someone made up to make math even harder. And now that you know that absolute value is related to distance, it will help you understand a useful application of absolute value in the realm of basic math. To see what I mean, suppose that you and your best friend each have a certain amount of money in your pockets, and one of you has more than the other. Now, it doesn't really matter to you who has more money, but you want to know the difference between the amounts. How do you find the difference between two amounts? Yep, you subtract them. And the answer you get from subtracting depends on the order of the numbers because subtracting doesn't have the commutative property, right? If we subtract the amounts in this order, 7 minus 4 will get the answer 3. But if we subtract the amounts in this order, 4 minus 7 will get the answer -3. Do you notice something about these answers? Yep. Even though the sign or direction is different, the magnitudes are the same. They're both 3. That means that the absolute values of the answers would be the same. And like I said, we don't really care who has more money. We just want to know how much that difference is. So in this problem, we only need the magnitude or absolute value of the difference. No matter which way we do the subtraction, we just take the absolute value of the answer to get what we want. And this idea can be really helpful when you're entering numbers into your calculator to solve math problems like this one. Let's say an airplane, we'll call it plane A, is flying at an altitude of 7,328 meters. And another plane, plane B, is flying at an altitude of 9,150 meters. And the problem asks you to find the difference in their altitudes. You know that means you need to subtract, so you quickly get out your calculator and start typing in the first number. But as soon as you get the 7,328 entered and hit the subtract button, you realize the second altitude is bigger. That means you'll have a negative number as your answer. Should you start over and type the bigger number first? Thanks to absolute value, you don't have to. No matter which order you subtract the numbers in, the magnitude of the answer will be the same. Just the direction or sign of the answer will be different. So if you continue on and enter 9,150 and then hit the equal sign, the answer you get is negative 1,822. Now all you have to do is mentally think of that number as an absolute value and ignore the minus sign. The difference in the altitudes of the two planes is 1,822 meters.
ค่ะจากโจทย์ข้อนี้นะคะเขาบอกว่าให้หาระยะห่างนะคะของเครื่องบิน2ลำนี้นะคะเครื่องบินลำ A นะคะสูงจากพื้นดินเนี่ย 7,328 เมตรนะคะเครื่องบินตัวที่เป็นเครื่องบิน B นะคะสูงจากพื้นดิน 9,150 เมตรนะคะเพราะฉะนั้นตัวนี้นะคะนักเรียนเขาถามหาระยะห่างนะคะนักเรียนจะเอา 7,328 ไปลบ 9,150 ค่าที่ได้จะเป็นไงคะติดลบแต่ถ้าเอา 9,150 ไปลบ 7,000 ตัวเนี้ยค่ะค่าที่ได้ก็จะเป็นบวกใช่ไหมคะเพราะฉะนั้นดังนั้น absolute ของลำ A ลบลำ B จะเท่ากับ absolute ของลำ B ลบลำ A นะคะเข้าใจใช่ไหมคะลูก
If you're not quite convinced of that, try the problem for yourself, subtracting both ways, and see what answers you get. In one case, you'll get 1,822, and in the other, you'll get negative 1,822. So now you know that in its most basic form, absolute value is just the distance between a number and zero on the number line. And you've also seen how it can be helpful when you want to find the difference between two different numbers, regardless of which is greater. In that case, the absolute value represents the distance between those two numbers. The last thing I want to show you in this video is how to handle a couple situations involving absolute value that you might encounter on tests when evaluating mathematical expressions. For example, what if you're asked to evaluate this expression involving absolute values? We learned how to multiply integers in the last video, but now these integers are inside absolute value signs. So what do? Well, when it comes to order of operations, absolute value signs are similar to parentheses, which means that you need to take care of them first before you start working on the other arithmetic operations. So in this problem, before we can multiply the integers, we need to take the absolute value of the numbers first. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3, and the absolute value of 5 is 5. So the problem simplifies to 3 times 5, which is 15. That example was pretty easy, but what about this one? Negative absolute value of negative 8. Why is there an extra negative sign outside of the absolute value signs? Well, whenever you see a negative sign immediately outside and to the left of a group like parentheses, braces, or the absolute value signs, it means that you need to negate that group. That means you need to multiply that group by negative 1. So if it helps, you can think of this problem like this. Negative 1 times the absolute value of negative 8. And since absolute value signs are groups like parentheses, to simplify it, we would first need to do the absolute value. The absolute value of negative 8 is 8. And then we multiply that by negative 1, and we get the answer, negative 8. That seems pretty simple too. But I want to use this example to point out an important difference.
ค่ะในตรงนี้นะคะนักเรียนต้องดูดีๆนะคะว่ามันมีลบของ absolute ของลบ8นะคะมีลบอยู่ข้างหน้า absolute เห็นไหมคะซึ่งเทียบเท่ากับลบ1ที่อยู่ข้างหน้าพอเราถอด absolute ของลบ8ออกมาได้ค่าเป็น8เอา8ไปคูณกับลบ1ต้องได้ลบ8นะคะอย่าลืมนะคะเด็กๆดูดีๆนะคะ
between parentheses and absolute value signs. It's a difference that can trick you on a test if you're not careful. Let's see the expression we just simplified side by side with a similar expression that has parentheses instead of absolute value signs. In both of these cases, the negative sign outside the group is telling us to negate the group. That means multiplying it by negative 1. But there's a very important difference between the two expressions. The order of operations rules tells us to do things that are inside of groups first, right? But there's nothing to do inside the parentheses. It's just a negative 8 hanging out inside of them. and the parentheses themselves don't tell us to do anything. So this expression is just asking us to multiply -1 times -8, which is +8. But in the case of the absolute value signs, while they do function like groups, they aren't just for grouping like the parentheses are. They're also
ในโจทย์ข้อนี้นะคะนักเรียนต้องระวังนะคะลบของลบ absolute นะคะจะมีค่าเป็น-1คูณกับ8ก็คือ-8นะคะแต่ถ้ามันเป็นลบวงเล็บ8นะคะมันจะหมายความว่า-1คูณอยู่กับ8ลบคูณลบจะกลายเป็นบวก1คูณ8ก็เลยจะได้8นะคะ
telling us to do something to whatever is inside of them. What are they telling us to do? They tell us to use the magnitude of the number inside, which would be +8. So in this expression, we multiply -1 times +8, which simplifies to -8. Do you see how it would be easy to confuse these examples on a test? They look similar at first glance, but they simplify to different answers. The key is to always remember that absolute value signs are not just there to group things. They're also asking you to find the absolute value of whatever number or expression is inside the group. All right, as you can see, absolute value is a lot more than just a way to turn negative numbers into positive ones, although that's basically what it does when you're just dealing with numbers on the number line. But it has lots of other applications in math too.
And look, this student has a negative attitude about math class. But not to worry, I put him in an absolute value sign, and presto, he comes out with a positive attitude about math class. Any questions?
Remember, you can't get good at math just by watching videos about it. You actually have to do practice problems so the ideas you're learning really sink in. So be sure to do some absolute value problems on your own. As always, thanks for watching Math Antics, and I'll see you next time. Learn more at mathantics.com.
ค่ะหลังจากที่เราได้ศึกษาวิดีโอเรียบร้อยแล้วนะคะเราก็จะทราบ vocabulary นะคะว่ามันมีอะไรบ้างนะคะคำแรกเป็น absolute value คือค่าสมบูรณ์นะคะ direction คือทิศทาง magnitude คือขนาดนะคะ amount คือจำนวนนะคะ extent คือขนาดหรือว่าขอบเขตนะคะ strength คือน้ำหนักหรือว่าขนาดนะคะ dimensional ก็คือมิตินะคะ multiply คือการคูณ negative number ก็คือจำนวนลบ positive number ก็คือจำนวนเต็มบวก distance คือระยะทาง vector คือลูกศรแสดงทิศทางนะคะ range คือความยาว difference คือแตกต่าง opposite number คือจำนวนที่ตรงกันข้ามค่ะหลังจากที่เราได้ศึกษาวิดีโอไปเรียบร้อยแล้วนะคะคุณครูก็จะมี exercise ที่5ให้นักเรียนนะคะซึ่งจะอยู่หลังจากตัวนี้นะคะหลังจากที่นักเรียนทำ exercise ที่5แล้วนะคะให้นักเรียนเขียนชื่อเลขที่แล้วค่อยถ่ายรูปนะคะแล้วก็โพสต์ลงใต้คอมเมนต์เพื่อส่งงานรับคะแนนไป5คะแนนนะคะเดี๋ยวเรามาดูซิว่า exercise ของเรามีอะไรบ้างนะคะ exercise ของเรานะคะจะต้องส่งภายในวันที่7กรกฎาคมนะคะเรามาดู exercise ของเราค่ะว่าจะมีอะไรบ้างนะคะนี่ค่ะคือข้อ1ใหญ่ข้อ2ใหญ่นะคะให้นักเรียนเติมคำตอบลงไปข้อ3ใหญ่แล้วก็ข้อ4ใหญ่นะคะหลังจากนั้นนะคะเราจะมาเจอกันในอีกทีใน EP 5ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องอะไรขอให้นักเรียนติดตามกันนะคะสวัสดีค่ะ